Cloud computing uses its own set of terminology. Uh, it's not used exactly the same by every single supplier. There is a tendency now for people to have stabilized on what they're talking about. Even so, you might meet some specific platform specific terminology that you'll need Mrs. Google to resolve for you. Key terms we've got are SAS, PAS, IAS, and I'm going to just spend a little bit of time going. So, software as a service means taking the software that we're using as a product and converting that into a service that we pay for by using it. So, instead of buying a full license for some particular software, we pay for however much it's used. An example here, for instance, would be Microsoft 365, which is the web service that the university uses for Office and PowerPoint and all these other kinds of things. And that's generally charged at about £3.95 a month. So that's a case of a service which generates revenue, continuous revenue. So we can look at that, for instance, say 365, it gives you Office, PowerPoint, Word, and all those kinds of things. If you wanted to buy the product outright on a CD or whatever, install that on your local machine. There's an upfront cost, a couple of £100. Seems like an awful lot more until you realize that over a year you're going to be paying £48 for 365, and then the next year another 48, and so on. And that continuous payment model generates stable revenue for the provider, and also clearly is more economic in the long term. For one thing, there are no intermediate costs. There are no shop costs, no wholesale costs. It's all no middlemen. If there are any issues with the software, they can all be corrected online, so that's your advantage. So this is a great way to reduce your initial outlay, but probably works out more expensive in the long term. So that's software as a service. Platform as a service means taking a fully configured virtual host. So an example here is something like Google Colab, which I know is free, but Salesforce is a very large company used by salespeople. They've got their platform, and that is paid for by on a monthly basis. Advantage, of course, is that if demand increases, then capacity can be also increased, and it is again it's pay by use. Infrastructure is the most interesting part from the computing perspective. So there we're talking about machines, database, things like routers, address management, and so on. All of these, particularly things like routers, may seem to have to be physical boxes, but in fact they can all be migrated into the cloud and their software run on existing compute infrastructure, and then you would pay for that separately. So the advantage of using infrastructure as a service is you can construct your own complete IT infrastructure, which is paid for on a usage basis. So if you need more hardware, then you can add more hardware. If you need to stop using services, then you can delete them and stop paying for them. Worthwhile considering, though, how much this is going to cost you in the long term. Another set of terminology you see quite a lot, BYOL, which stands for Bring Your Own License. So if you are a site which has an Oracle site license, for example, which is quite an expensive thing, and you want to use a cloud-based service, instead of renting the service and then paying again for a license which you've got, you're allowed to bring your own license, and the license checking software will then refer to your own data. Looking at providers, the cloud providers are highly competitive. Amazon was the first. They started, it says here they started EC2 in 2006. The first service they actually had was S3, where they rented out their network capacity. They do claim this was all part of a planned development. They had a global vision, but the way it appeared was S3 started, obviously worked out advantageous to them, and then they started EC2 a few years later. Azure, or Asia as you often hear it called, started in 2010. So at the moment Amazon has about 40% of the overall market, and Azure is coming up second. The whole market is growing, so Amazon is growing, but Azure is growing faster. When Azure started, it just offered Windows services, and it became pretty clear you have to pay Windows license fees, and so they started after a year or two offering Linux services as well. Linux being open source, you don't have to pay a license fee to the provider, so you're just paying for the hardware. Google has a range of applications which are cloud-based, but they're a lot less interested in the consumer market. If you like, the key breakthrough Amazon made was realizing that you could charge someone 10 cents an hour or whatever for compute, so a couple of dollars, and still bill them and make a profit on it. And of course, once following on from their example, Microsoft saw this was extremely lucrative. And a couple of years ago, there was some discussion that actually Amazon shopping is of course huge, but the part of Amazon which generated the most profit was actually EC2. Although Amazon shopping is huge, because the e-commerce market has such narrow margins, is so competitive, there's very little profit in it compared to EC2. There are numerous other companies that we can mention. IBM focuses on the enterprise, so people who are using existing mainframes and so on, and lots of other smaller suppliers in there as well. So getting started in cloud computing, this is something we should discuss. Most of the providers have a free layer or startup offer. You need to be extremely careful with these. So I would suggest, if you're starting a service and it asks for your credit card, don't give it. Not because they're going to cheat you or anything like that, but you might start services that you didn't intend to necessarily, and then you get billed on your card. So free, the free layer means certain services are free, but the most interesting services are not free. They are actually very good about warning you what is on the free tier and what isn't on the free tier. So that's Amazon. They give you 750 hours per month, sign up by credit card. Azure actually give you something like, it says £125. I think it's currently $100, but you have to use it within a certain amount of time. So you can use more services on Azure to start off with, but then it expires a lot quicker, whereas Amazon will give you 750 hours of compute essentially for a year. Both of those have student options, and we'll be using the Azure student option during the classes. So I just mention again, don't use your credit card to sign up. It is quite safe. There's more chance of you making a mistake though, and inadvertently using some service which appears to be very cheap and actually costs mount up. The reason that costs mount up is you'll see there's something like there are 750 hours in a month. So if you see a service which is 10 cents an hour, then you end up with a $75 bill at the end of the month. And so please be a little bit careful there. We will be using the command line quite a lot on the module. I'll explain some more about this later. Very often there are graphic interfaces to get things started, but mostly when we're talking about remote services, we'll be using the console and web-based interfaces. We won't be using RDPs, which is what Windows uses for the above-mentioned licensing issue. So that's a summary slide. I would refer you to this book, the first one on the list, which is on our reading list. Very easy to read, goes into more detail of all the concepts I've covered here, and you can get that online through the library.